Hello, welcome to Lecture 4, where we'll start getting into the actual grammar of Middle Egyptian finally, after 4 or 6 lectures, depending on how you're counting, and begin our discussion of nouns and adjectives. Just to give you a general sense of what we're doing, now that we're actually covering the grammar, I'm working out of Middle Egyptian Grammar by James Hoch. It is one of 2 modern grammars, i.e., published in the last 20 years, of Middle Egyptian that's out there. I guess technically it's a little more than 20 years. My edition is 1997. But I'm altering the order a little bit into a way that I think is better for reference, because ultimately my vision for this is something that people can refer back to in addition to a course. So I'll be covering parts of the first 4 chapters in all of the next few lectures, without really moving forward past that point, but just covering each group of parts of speech differently. So we're going to be doing nouns and adjectives, and then prepositions and particles and pronouns, and then verbs in that order. So we aren't going to do any sentence structure stuff in this lecture. We're not going to do any verbs. We're not going to do any prepositions, just nouns and adjectives. We'll do the rest later. Brief overview of nouns. The function is broadly identical to English. Person, place, thing, concept. Same general idea. However, unlike English, there are 2 full genders. That is to say that there are more than just a couple of loan words that have gendered aspects. Masculine and feminine are the 2 genders, same as quite a lot of languages, especially the Semitic languages that are closely related, just have the 2 genders. More complicated gender systems are possible for those of you wondering, but masculine and feminine is the most common. And then you have 3 numbers. Singular and plural, probably already familiar with from English. The dual is a little different. It is used specifically when there's 2 of an item, and it isn't always used when there's 2. It's a little unclear if the dual is still productive. That is to say, if you can still make a new dual word, a new word in this particular number, or if you can only use it in stock phrases and with certain nouns. I lean towards its being productive, but I'm not exactly an expert on the topic. There are remnants of a dual in the Semitic languages. If you speak Arabic or Hebrew or Aramaic or something like that, you might notice that certain words, like body parts, very commonly that come in pairs, like your hands, your ears, your eyes, your feet, your arms, your legs, all that, they have different plurals. They take a very different form than you would expect based on the root. And that's a remnant of what used to be a full dual. You used to be able to do it with anything. You had 2 cats, you'd use the dual, as opposed to 3 cats, you'd use the plural. But now in the Semitic languages, it's quite limited, and in Egyptian, it's somewhat limited. Probably you could make new terms, but it's most commonly found in a set of stock phrases like body parts, the 2 kingdoms of Egypt, the 2 lands, usually get in the plural, that kind of thing. This is the declension table in transcription, how you'd write it out. We'll look at the hieroglyphs in a minute. The masculine singular is unmarked. That's just the root of the word. The feminine singular is a T. Now, this T was probably not pronounced all the time. It was probably only pronounced when there was an ending attached. But the Egyptians still thought of that T as being important as the feminine marker. So even though they weren't pronouncing it most of the time, they wrote it all the time. They basically never omit that final T. Even if it's a word that's like written out with a bi or triliteral, usually the T will be separate from the bi or triliteral, and they'll write it out. Even if they're not putting infinite complements or determiners or whatever, the word will end in T. They really want to make sure you know that it's feminine. This is really helpful, very consistent. Also, for those of you curious about other linguistic stuff, this T dropping happened in the Semitic languages too quite a bit. This is why Hebrew nouns, for example, that are feminine don't end in at, they end in a in the singular. And same thing in Egyptian. It probably sounded like it ended in a or a or something like that. The masculine dual is represented with we, and feminine dual is represented with ty. Um, the Y is just the dual marker pretty much, and it goes on the other ending because the masculine singular doesn't have anything, but masculine plural does have an ending, so they just attach the Y to that, and it's attached to the feminine T for feminine nouns. Again, this is pretty easy to memorize, and then the masculine plural is W, and the feminine plural, in theory, is a W followed by a T, but it's very uncommon that they'd actually write out the W. So usually it will just look like a T. As we're going to find out in a minute, they have other ways of indicating the plural than just writing these out, which is very helpful. But this is what the orthography would look like in its standard form. And I put standard in quotation marks because this is actually less common than other forms of the orthography. But this is if the Egyptians were literally writing everything out, which is not what they like to do. This is what it would look like at the end of all of the words. You have the quail chick W, the loaf T, and the Y, whenever it's being used in this way as a marker of the dual, use two strokes. That's the Y marker, which I believe it came from hieratic, but it actually meshes pretty well with how the plural gets used in reality. Because as it turns out, the Egyptians came up with a much more efficient method of marking a plural than writing the W out or the Y out. Originally, back in Old Egyptian, and you can still see this occasionally in Middle Egyptian, but not that often. They would write out part of the word 2 or 3 times for the dual and the plural. For example, when you want to say the two lands, you wouldn't put down that ta and then write a Y. You'd put down 2 of the ta symbol. In the Old Kingdom, this was the standard way of marking the plural. It happened especially with the determinatives. The phonetic part of the word would be written out, and then you'd write 3 determinatives. So one example I remember, Tomb of Weni, this Old Kingdom official, and his troops attacked some forts, and he talked about it. It happened to be relevant to my research at the time, so I remember it distinctly. And he wrote it out. The kind of fort is called a Wenet, WNT. No need to go into how that's written, just the regular thing. But then the fort determinative was written 3 times. So you have 3 little pictures of a fort instead of 1. The Egyptians further developed this method, and by Middle Egyptian, they'd come up with a much easier way of doing that. Instead of writing the determinative symbol 3 times, they just follow the symbol they wanted to write 3 times with 3 dashes, 3 short vertical strokes underneath it. And that is how you're going to see the plural almost all the time in Middle Egyptian. It's usually how it's marked. Occasionally, you'll see a W that isn't part of the spelling of the word, and then you'll think, oh, right, yes, that's the plural. But you're much more likely to see 3 dashes. And similarly, the dual 2 dashes. That's why it's kind of convenient that the Y can be represented by those 2 dashes. That it just works out very well. The regular hieroglyph and the 2 reed leaves look very similar to the dual strokes, which then merge in hieratic. It's just very nice for our reading of it, suffice it to say. So here are some examples, and I mentioned the word ta because this shows up in the dual a lot, but can also definitely be in the singular and definitely be in the plural. So very good for that. Also, good determinative, or not determinative, good biliteral to get into your head. So the first ta there, that's just your regular singular ta, and then the dual written twice, and the plural writing it out 3 times. That's kind of how you do it in Old Egyptian. And you basically never see just ta on its own like that, because the only thing that ta means, unless it's part of another word and being used as a biliteral as part of the phonetic spelling, is land, which is also what's being depicted there. It's a little bit of an abstract picture, but that's supposed to be like a little stretch of land, maybe some irrigation or whatever. You can use your imagination, I guess. So on the right side, the first of those 3, that's what you're going to really see for ta, is with the stroke underneath it, because it's an ideogram or a logogram or whatever you want to call it. It is literally what is being depicted. And then you have the dual strokes, that oblique kind of Y thing, which would be the two lands, although you're more likely to see it written out twice, just because it kind of looks better. And then if you wanted to talk about several lands, the pharaoh conquered many lands or whatever, then you'd have Tau would be the Ta with the three strokes. Now we need to go over adjectives a little bit. Adjectives are declined like the nouns they modify. So exactly that same table from earlier, this is the adjective declension table. So if you want to say the beautiful man or the handsome man or whatever, if you care about that in particular, the word for beautiful or good is nefer. Probably heard that one before on some occasion or another. So if you want to say the beautiful man, that would be es nefer, or it's conventionally pronounced sa for whatever reason, so sa nefer. And then for woman, woman is sat, then you'd have sat nefret with a T at the end. Beautiful men would be sao nefru, etc. You always just match whatever it's modifying. And they always follow the noun. This is in contrast to English, where they basically always precede it. There's a little bit of an exception to this that we're going to get into in a minute, relating to a particular form of a construct possessive. You can string them together, just like in English. Just put them behind the noun, and then they all apply to that noun. Adjectives can serve as a kind of noun as well. They usually mean that there's one particular individual and are followed by the human determinative, which is how you can tell. So for example, if you wanted to talk about a poor person, you use the adjective for poor, nejes, and then you'd put a human determinative behind it, and that's how you can tell. In the original pronunciation, there may have been some kind of like vowel shift or something like that that signified, oh, this you mean a poor person, not that something is poor or whatever. This is contrasted to English, where you can say things like the poor, but when you say the poor, you mean the collective of people who don't have a lot of money, not one particular lower class individual. You can also have non-human adjective nouns, but basically, as a rule, they're feminine, which is worth noting, because most of the time adjectives won't have a T at the end, but you can have a feminine or you can have a feminine adjectival noun that shows up all the time. So Hoch gives it as examples. Nefret would be a good thing, or Ha'at would be a great thing, or whatever. And you just have to pay attention to that. If you see an adjective just kind of hanging around in the feminine, that's what it means. It means an adjective thing, or slight changes to that as appropriate, but that's the basic sense of it. So here's that noun adjective agreement. Same example as I mentioned. You have sa nefer and sat neferet. Already talked about that. Just I do want to say that that banjo-looking thing, which is I think properly the pelvic bone and spine of a cow that has been made into like a musical instrument kind of thing. That's nefer, N-F-R. And then here you have the adjectival nouns. So you have nejes, which is just poor. I forgot the determinative there, but that's fine. This is just a phonetic spelling, and we're not learning that as a vocabulary word yet. And those birds, the bird determinative at the end of nejes deserves special discussion and will be dealt with at a later date. And then you have nejes, man. Again, there'd be a determinative separating that, but that seated man determinative tells you, oh, this means the humanized version of it, so to speak. Something very important to know about Egyptian nouns, something that shows up a lot, is this thing called the bound construction. That's what Hoch calls it. It's very, very similar to the point that's probably the same thing originally as a grammatical form common to the Semitic languages known as the construct. The construct is a form of a noun, and you wouldn't say tense properly, but it's a form of a noun that undergoes some slight shifts and which acts as a possessive. We don't know in Egyptian if the noun changed. I wouldn't be surprised if the vowels got weaker, because that's just common. But the basic sense is the same. You have two nouns, and you want to link them by possession. This is two ways to do this in Egyptian. We're talking about one today, and we'll go over the other one in the next lecture, where we're going to be discussing prepositions, because the possessive adjective, as it's called, functions like a preposition. It's very similar to one in many ways. So I feel it's best grouped in there. The basic syntax is if you have two nouns, X and Y, you can interpret that as being the X of Y. So if you have the house of Ra, Per Re, then you get, so Per Re is the house of Re, or Re's house, which would be his temple. Things like that. It's not terribly complicated, other than that it's kind of in the opposite order you'd expect, because in English, 9 times out of 10, you're using the noun followed by S is the possessor, and then the possessee follows. And in English, or in Egyptian, it's the opposite order. One thing to be careful about is that this is exactly the same way Egyptian expresses and, because there's no words for and or. Egyptian just doesn't really have coordinating conjunctions. So they express that relationship by just slapping the nouns next to each other. This is occasionally confusing. Big one, something that I've run into in my own translations, is grandfather is your father, or your mother's father, for your maternal grandfather. But your mother and father would be written exactly the same way. So it's important to know what exactly is being discussed. Pay attention to subject verb agreement, that kind of thing, to make sure you don't slip up there. So word of warning, be careful. Here's an example. Neb Per, Neb is Lord, Per is house, so the Neb Per is the Lord of the house. Bound construction, you just put an of between them. Easiest way to figure that out. There is a special case of the bound construction that will show up occasionally. Happens a lot as epithets of gods or of people. Noun, adjective, noun. And the adjective will agree with the first word, but it'll modify the last word. And this is the exception I mentioned. This is the time where an adjective will come before the thing it modifies. So here's an example. It's kind of idiomatic. Sa, ka, sa. The first sa is conventional. The second sa is actually how we pronounce it, which is S aleph. Ka means high, and sa means back, as in like the far part of your body from your chest. And so what you ka sa together means haughty. That's the sense of it. So this is a haughty man. That whole thing is basically functioning as an adjective, but you can also parse it as a bound construction. So a man of arrogance effectively is what this is, or an arrogant man in better English. And this happens a lot with these idiomatic phrases related to body parts that express emotions and personal qualities. Your heart is heavy or light, meaning that you're feeling guilty, or you're doing very well. Your stuff like that. A lot of these body metaphors, of which the Egyptians are quite fond. It's not too hard to remember. Just looking at the words, you'll pretty quickly figure out what's going on. But important to note as a matter of grammar here. And that's all we can do with what we have, with just nouns and adjectives. Next week, we're doing the prepositions and the pronouns and the particles. This is exciting. Means we get our first sentences, because we can finally start putting words together in a meaningful way. I'd recommend studying the vocabulary of chapters 1 through 4. If you have decided, perhaps foolishly, to use this as your sole teaching aid for hieroglyphics, yeah, just study vocab up through chapter 4. And then after this, as always, we're going to end with some biliterals. If you do not care about biliterals, end the video now. Otherwise, just keep watching. And these are all the biliterals that end in I. We have a couple for me. There are a few listed on the Wikipedia list that don't show up on Hoch, so I put them all here. Me is most common as that. I don't know quite what to call it. It's always looked to me like the thing that's carried on the box, by the bee on the box of Honey Nut Cheerios, like a little honey dripper kind of deal. And that means like, as in X is like Y, you form a simile with. That is rather common as a subordinating conjunction. Is me. T is a candle. D, not in Hoch's list. Something that will come up later as a form of a particular verb that shows up a lot. It looks almost like a little tent. I don't know what it is supposed to represent. I think it's a kind of bread, because of there's another form of this where it's being held in a guy's arm, and there it looks like a piece of bread. There are two biliterals that end in ion. W-ion, that means one, as in, just a single instance. And then the cha, I believe that one is, I can't remember, so I won't say authoritatively, but I'm pretty sure that one is used in words for horizon, but that one might be, I might be getting that in the reverse order, that one's ach. Actually, I believe that's correct. It's ach and not cha, but that one does show up occasionally, does deserve mention. A lot of biliterals in W. Aleph W is a side of beef. U is the whole calf rather than just a part of it. Mu is water. This is cognate with all of the various Semitic languages. That mu sign, or possibly even the N sign, is where I believe the letters M and N end up originating from. Nu, most commonly, is that jar, but occasionally you'll see it with that little crook kind of looking thing. I think that's a little less common. Ru is the lion. Later in Egyptian history, that will come to represent L, which never, it was always present. There was an L sound, but it was not properly represented as a consonant. It just kind of got put in other places. Possibly it was like an alternate form of other consonants, like it would get confused sometimes, R and L would switch around, or N and L would switch around. They were like alternate pronunciations in different dialects or whatever. We know they had some kind of L thing going on, and eventually the lion was used to write that, but Middle Egyptian, that's RW. Khu is a hand holding a flail. Su, that's a sedge plant, but a much better way to think of that is king, because when you see that, except occasionally, it does have some other meanings, but very, very often the king is being mentioned or referenced in some way. Shu, that's an ostrich feather, the feather of Ma'at, the guardian of truth and justice and all that. And then the underline does not show up here for whatever reason, but that is supposed to be Jew. D underline W, Janja W. That is two mountains, is Jew. Lab, Aleph V is, I don't know what that is, but it looks like a lamp. I think it is supposed to be a chisel. Some of these are rather abstract to our eyes, and it's hard to tell what was meant. Ib, Ib means a couple of things, but especially it means heart, which is that one on the right. And then Neb means lord or master, or as an adjective, it means each, every, or all. These are easy to get confused. If you're having trouble with the translation, try it with both meanings. One of them will make way more sense. Then finally, two biliterals in P. Hoch only lists one of these, but I thought the other was important to include. Wep is ox horns, of like longhorn cattle. It means open, and gate as a noun. Open as a verb, or perhaps as an adjective. And then tep. Tep is very commonly the head. And usually it means like chief or most important or in charge or whatever, so, something like that, although it also does literally mean head. And note that that's a side view of a head. The front view of a head is a different word that also comes up rather commonly. That's all for the biliterals. I will see you in the next video where we will be discussing pronouns, prepositions, and particles.